All right, everyone, welcome to Tonic Discussions Episode 2. Today we're talking about another controversial issue, as we'll probably continue to do until we run out of them and can talk about more mundane things. Today, we're talking about trans stuff. So probably talking about transsexuality and identity a little bit, but maybe talking about the relationship between transhumanism. Who knows where it'll go? But we're going to take a bit of time getting into that issue because of recent controversies, especially with Budweiser. And, without further ado, does anyone have any opening ideas as to why this is such an issue in the cultural zeitgeist?
Well, I can start, I guess. I think, well, for me, I think the first thing we have to recognize when we talk about trans anything is that we're looking at a whole range of phenomena, not just one thing. Like, even if we only focus on the adolescent version of the mania, we have a bunch of different variables and dynamics that are in play. How much of it is a genuine mental illness? How much is a viral fad? How much is youthful rebellion? How much is a tool to gain woke social status, or even to armor themselves against woke attacks? There's a lot of, how it is to be a young adolescent or a teenager. There's a lot of stuff going on. How much is a weaponized form of Munchausen by proxy, by a psyop of some sort? How much of it is brought to you by Pfizer or brought to you by Monsanto? This Hydra has a whole lot of heads, and I think, and this may be controversial, but how much of what we're seeing is something more like raw demonic energy, like a weapon wielded by agents that exist in, I don't know, the same liminal space as minds or souls, or maybe even a physical being that's difficult to perceive as, it's like subatomic particles. I won't harp on that. That's my thing, but I think it is something to consider, given like the suddenness of this. We talk about the death drive and we try to come up with a bunch of rational cause and effect explanations for that. And I'm not saying that there isn't more readily apparent evidence to consider there, including psyops and whatnot. But suppose we were to take, I don't know, symmetry as a fundamental property of reality, which I do. And I think maybe that's the only property we can understand as living segments of it. Then I think we also have to take seriously the idea that the mirror opposite of life is an inertia and it's not equilibrium. The opposite would be something like an anti-life force, something that actively tries to achieve that state of maximum equilibrium or inertia, the same way that life tries to escape it. And how that relates to trans, I think you could see the whole phenomenon as more than just a trend or a planned op. I think we have to seriously consider the idea of some kind of a masked spiritual assault, and one that's amplified by our global communications networks and other, modern tools and toys. If demons exist in the way that I think they do, then they'd certainly use those networks, those devices, as backdoors to the psyche, or at the very least as distractions while they're doing their break-ins. Some people who study possession as a paranormal phenomenon tend to think of them as Dracula, where the human mind is like a house party that's invitation only. But I think that there are probably other methods. Like if you look at what happened there's a British criminologist named Richard Hoskins that everybody should look into his story. And this is a man who wound up having a sex change in his 40s, after years of investigating cases of ritual human sacrifice. And I know that Stone Age Herbalist did a great write-up about that one, and it's fucking disturbing on a whole shitload of levels. Hoskins is, and he's only one of like many really strange and tragic accounts of detransitions that I've read about these past few years. The way these people suffer, it's much more than like Cronenberg body horror. It's like a mythological torture of the old gods, and even there, it's like Prometheus got off easy, it was only his liver. And they're just absolutely tormented in body and mind on a daily basis. And it's just the most lonely and broken people you can imagine. And most of them were just callously abandoned by all of those authorities who convinced them to take that step in the first place. It's really sick. And the moment the damage was done, they just got ghosted. And that's the kind of evil that makes me wonder if there's something more than politics and profit behind this. They've literally been cut off, not just from the pleasures of sex, but from genuine romantic relationships. The trans woman can't get down with straight guys or gay guys because the straights think he's gross and he lacks the tools for gay. And the same goes for the trans man. I think that's why you see so many of these ex-men and ex-women couple, because they're the only ones that will have each other at that point. And probably not for long, because they still lack the tools to get the job done. And then there's all these studies that show suicide rates of these people who get these Frankenstein surgeries. They don't drop, not appreciably. And I have a feeling that it's a bit of a fun with numbers artifact, like that the real picture would show even more suicides among these mutilated people. Because at the end of the day, it's an insanely cruel thing that was done to them at a time when they were probably very weak. And it was done to them with a smile and a parade, And that social cheerleading for trans, I think, is the other half of the puzzle, which I think we have to address separately. But I've talked a bunch already, so let me pass the mic to anyone who wants it. Luke, John, I know we've written about many of the same things when it comes to this.
I mean, I don't know, man. I think we can stop recording now. You pretty much
that was
solved the problem.
Like,
That was
great.
great.
That was awesome.
So much there.
That was an incredibly comprehensive overview of the issue. And yeah, man, I remember that that article by Stone Age Herbalist. That was incredibly terrifying. The background there for listeners who might not know about it is that this guy, he wasn't just like looking into ritual murders. It was quite specifically ritual murders involving witchcraft, like African witchcraft, and that aspect of his career started when he was doing, was it anthropological work, I think, in Africa. And he got mixed up with this stuff there, and I think was told that he'd been cursed or something as a result of that by like one of the local witches. And then when he went back to the UK, because of his pre-existing knowledge base surrounding that, when Nigerian immigrants started doing these really horrific child sacrifices, using African children smuggled into the UK for precisely that purpose, the constabulary retained him as kind of like an expert to investigate these crimes. So it just kind of like followed him throughout his life. And then, yeah, it drove him off the edge, and he ended up transitioning and just like, just like the psychic pain of encountering these things broke his psyche. Well, and so, you could see like that's kind of a very acute, horrific example of maybe something that a lot of people are experiencing right now. We're in this evolutionarily novel environment, as the Weinsteins would have it. And this creates quite a lot of friction with our instincts, like our like nothing really makes sense to people, and there's this constant low level stress that makes people want to escape who they are. So then they go on the internet and they become someone else, and some of them get really sucked deep into that. They start LARPing as something completely other than what they are, thinking, I can escape from this horrible life if I become this other person, right? And of course it doesn't work. Like the further you go deep into that, the more pain and suffering you have. That's why the suicide rate is so incredibly high for post-op transsexuals, because they realize, like, after they've like severely mutilated themselves, like oh, I'm not a real girl after all. And it all kind of comes crashing down to them. And if you were to like look at this from an actual demonic perspective, what are demons doing? Well, they're eating pain, they're eating psychic suffering, right? So they want to create conditions that maximize that suffering. If they're somehow outside of time or sideways in time, they could take a very long view of things and, have lead people down paths that cause very small amounts of suffering at any given time. And you think you're doing the right thing, you think you're moving towards something good, and all the while it's like just leading you towards this huge payoff when it harvests you. So yeah, I mean, I don't know that I said anything that Mark didn't say there. That was more of just kind of an expansion of my riffing on it. Anyone else want to have a go?
Yeah, Daniel, did you want to say something first?
Oh, no, I was just gonna say, and this Luke or Harrison, you made, or any of you made, was it Sartre that had that whole statement about existence precedes essence, and this maybe just like to tie it into Mark's spiritual theme, like, whatever spirit was behind that brand of existentialism, you don't have an identity, you get to create it for yourself. That's your only identity, is having this burden of freedom to choose your own identity. It seems like this is kind of the reductio ad absurdum extreme of that, sentiment.
Yeah, it wasn't what was it Marx said about I think it was Marx said being is prior to consciousness or something like that, or no, that's the traditional view, but that consciousness is prior to being, or to existence. I can't remember the exact quote, but yeah, that idea that essentially we create our own identity, society creates us, there's nothing intrinsic to us, and that makes human nature a lot more malleable than it is in reality, which I think that kind of worldview probably underlies a lot of this. It probably provides some of the initial conditions for this kind of thing to take place. But one of the things that I was wondering and thinking about when Mark was talking is he laid out all these possibilities, like a psychogenic illness, an actual mental illness, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm wondering, I'm not a huge history buff, but I can't remember any previous time in history for a similar phenomenon taking over. Now, maybe there's an underlying psychological reality, like some kind of hysteria that can take multiple forms, and this is just the form it's taken today. But I find it curious that this seems to me to be a relatively new phenomenon, like something that hasn't really happened before. And I think maybe part of the reason for that is that the technology, the medical technology and the medical methodologies now allow for, at least the appearance of an actual sex change operation, whereas previously, that hadn't been possible. So if, you probably wouldn't have had something like this 100 years ago, 200 years ago, or 1,000 years ago. So there's that.
I say
but
that I still don't think it's possible though. It's still not possible.
Yeah.
Because we're not in the realm
Right.
of possible. We're in the realm of cosmetics.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Didn't
sorry.
Origin,
Yeah, I mean, to really do it, like you would have to be able to dissolve the body the way a butterfly's or a caterpillar's body dissolves inside the cocoon, and then even switch out the DNA, the Y chromosome for the X chromosome or vice versa in every single one of the cells, and then reconstitute it as in the form of the opposite sex. And oh, maybe I'm just being technologically pessimistic here, but I don't think we're going to have transmogrification cocoons of that sophistication anytime in the next couple of years.
No.
What's the problem is it's natural to what, your entire being, so I'm curious, does anyone, I think what Mark and what everybody said so far, I think resonates with everyone, but is there anyone that wants to try to steelman the idea that for some people, going through any part of this process is appropriate, whether it's just real life experience and changing the way that you present and dress versus using hormones that have the risk of, sterilization, up to and including surgery? Are there instances where this is appropriate, or is it always something where, fundamentally you're chasing something that you can't have, and so it's gonna not end well. I'm very libertarian in my mindset, and so that whole, do what you will but accept the consequences as long as you're not initiating force is kind of central to the way I see things. But at the same time, that gets into enabling people to do things that aren't in their interest. And so, like, you can at least say what you think and share your candid thoughts, but that's perceived as threatening and violence and so on. So I think that's where this all gets so complicated, because I think we all kind of agree that if there are any applications, they're incredibly limited. But do any of you think that there are certain applications and instances where using hormones, using surgeries in order to affirm gender dysphoria into, or I guess as a strategy of resolving gender dysphoria, so that somebody can continually present more easily as the opposite sex?
I would, my sort of instinct is to say that, like, ultimately it's an extreme form of body modification, and humans have been doing that for as long as we've been Homo sapiens. If someone wants to do that, like they genuinely want to do that, like okay, where I think the problem lies is in the lionization of that as something extremely praiseworthy, like leading people down that path when, it's going to cause all sorts of problems for them later on, and they're almost certain to regret it because it's so irreversible. It's a lot more than ultimately, getting a tattoo or your lip pierced or something. And then being required, like, and this is, I guess, maybe not so much the case in the US where you have a privatized healthcare system, but in a lot of other countries, it's the taxpayer who ultimately is funding it, which is another kind of issue. If I want to go and get a tattoo, like, I pay for that myself, it's a cosmetic thing.
But yeah, maybe
okay, Luke.
Yeah, I just wanted to try to steelman it a little bit more, because I mean, historically, this idea I think has to do with the basic fact that we humans, we kind of occupy like an in-between space, right, between like the animal world and the higher world, if you will. And in any case, there's a clear distinction between humans and animals, and of course part of our part of this distinction is that we are conscious and that we have a mind that can actually take decisions and is way more independent, let's say, from our programming and the material world, if you will, than for like lower animals. So I think that's what people kind of realized, and some people just in the 60s and 70s like were in this sort of intellectual battle against what we might call like essentialism. It's become a slur, but the extreme version of that might be some kind of theory that says, we are basically all just programmed by our genes. We don't have free will, and we're just like this kind of materialist, view. And I think there's a certain dialectic going on, and people have, and perhaps rightfully so, try to emphasize a bit the mind aspect of our existence, and the fact that we are more independent from our programming, from the material world, than, let's say, lower animals, and that's essentially what makes us human. And I think that the whole gender thing kind of ties into that, because I mean, why not? You can see how you can consciously decide, to be more feminine or to be more masculine, for example, or you can consciously adapt different roles. So there is some fluidity, let's say, in that, and so that's where the idea, I think, comes from, that it's even possible, to kind of switch gender and that sort of thing. And obviously like this has taken a life of its own, and it's gone to like extremes. And what John said about this celebration aspect, I mean, this it also it comes from this this enemy, right? This hostility towards like what they call essentialism. So it's kind of like it rallies your troops, right? And so you get this affirmation going, and everything is great about it, and you influence people to that degree. But yeah, to steelman that, I think in rare cases, I don't see why it shouldn't be like a possibility that there are like some people who actually, for whatever reason, can maybe talk about that, but just completely feel like their gender identity doesn't match with, you know, with their biology. There's some disconnect between mind and matter, let's say, and it might be possible in very few exceptional cases, and it might even be, but that's a kind of a different question, but it might even be that for some of them, it might be a good idea to do some kind of you know, medical procedure, as you put it, Grant, that might make life a little easier for them. And it used to be that this was done after like long therapy sessions, you know, a long process. You couldn't just do it willy-nilly. And so yeah, why not, I would say, as long as it is within strict limits, as long as there's like you know, is not promoted or encouraged necessarily. Yeah, so that's my attempt to kind of steelman the whole thing a little bit.
I'll add a couple things to that. So one is that even 10, 15 years ago, if you looked at the statistics, I mean, there was, it's a tiny percentage. I can't remember what the actual demographics are of gender dysphoria, but it was something like, I'm guessing like 1 in 10,000 or something, like a tiny fraction of the population, and the majority, something like 9 out of 10, were boys. So it was primarily a young male phenomenon in you know, in the psychiatric condition or whatever is how it was considered. Nowadays, it's orders of magnitude more prominent, and primarily in like teenage girls. So there's, and of course that led some researchers, I can't remember her name, but there was this one you know, one psychologist who wrote a paper that was on this subject, positing this rapid onset gender dysphoria to kind of distinguish it from everything that had been experienced before, to try to capture this phenomenon that there's something else going on. This gets back to one of the options Mark laid out about this being essentially a fad. You know, in the psychological community, they'd call it like a psychogenic illness. It's like suicide clusters, where in a specific environment, you might have like a teenage suicide, and then you'll see that suicides will crop up at a higher rate than normal around that suicide. You know, people at the same school, kids at closer schools. And so you'll see these suicide clusters, and it's a you know, it's an accepted phenomenon that, you know, if there's a big suicide and it happens, you're going to find more suicides. So this researcher was positing rapid onset gender dysphoria. So this will be where you have like an entire peer group of girls, like 7 girls who are all friends, and then 6 or all 7 of them in a very short time will all start, you know, identifying as transgender. So there's something else going on. Along the point of the Steelman argument, you look at the previous, how things used to be. Now take that as a kind of baseline. Now, of course, it's possible that it's not, that baseline isn't the same today as it was 10 or 15 years ago. It might even be higher, because you do get, because all sorts of mental illness have increased in time, you know, especially over the past 10, 15 years. If you look at like Jonathan Haidt's work, where teenagers, especially, what was it especially? Well, teenagers, the rates of even like anxiety and depression are going through the roof, or at least increasing at a fast rate. And so that there's probably, I'd say there's at least two possibilities there, that you might have an actual increase in the frequency of actual like traditional gender dysphoria, as well as a huge new phenomenon that's increased as well, which is this rapid onset form, which, like as Mark says, there might be a lot more going on here. And I'd say I'd agree with Mark, probably is a lot more going on here. But limiting what I'll say, to this sphere of discourse, if we look at that smaller percentage, this is along the lines of what Luke was saying. I wrote a piece, I think it was on the school shooter recently, the transgender school shooter, and in the comments, someone had brought up Wendy Carlos. I don't know if everyone's familiar with Wendy Carlos, composer. She did the soundtrack for like Clockwork Orange, the kind of the classical music using electronics, using synthesizers. And I'd always thought that Wendy Carlos was a woman. And in the comments, it was like she actually wasn't. It was a guy. She was, and this was in the 70s, like 60s and 70s. And so I looked her up a bit, and coincidentally, I'd just seen, like scrolling through Facebook the week before, a clip of Wendy Carlos demonstrating her like synthesizer techniques and all the equipment she was using, and she had these sideburns, and I'm like, wow, why is she pretending to be a guy? It's kind of weird, but kind of fun. I guess artists will always like that. And then in the comments, someone had said, oh, well, yeah, and in those videos of him with the sideburns, it looks like a guy, pretending to be a woman or something. But I had the total opposite impression. I was like, oh, this is obviously a woman pretending to be a guy and dressed as a guy for some reason. And so just as an example of a case where it's like you seeing, well, I see John's got his hand up. Do you have something to say there? John, you're muted.
Finish your point, and then
well, no, I'm just kind of trailing off. It was just as an example of at that time period, you would find people that did seem to like at an older age, genuinely, like Luke was saying, have this long-term like steady dysphoria, to the point where they did seem like they were more comfortable on the whole presenting as the opposite sex. And kind of like, to take a kind of libertarian perspective, it'd be like, okay, I'm okay with that. And especially in the case of someone like Wendy Carlos, where for like to any casual observer, you'd actually think that she was a woman. And it's not like she's this obvious guy getting off on, like an autogynephiliac or something. It's not like she's a guy getting off on presenting as a woman, which is pretty obvious when you see it. So I was just bringing her up as an example of that.
Yeah. So speaking of the rapid onset gender dysphoria, so Mark, in his introduction, he mentioned Munchausen's by proxy, and I think so. Social contagion inside the sort of teenage girl milieu is certainly a factor here, but we also have to look at the sociological and institutional context in which these girls are growing up, because teenage girls, quite especially, are very sensitive to what's expected of them, and they like to be good, right? So on the one hand, you've got a lot of parents who have absorbed the idea that trans is beautiful and allyship is really morally important, and so on. And it certainly seems to be the case, what with all the drag queen story hours and such, the pride flags everywhere, that you have parents who are kind of subtly indicating to their kids that it wouldn't be such a bad, I would accept you whoever you are, meaning I want you to be this, right? And then you have the case of the Jeff Younger case in Texas, where the mother, I mean, they're divorced, the mother got custody and then seems to have gaslit one of the twin boys into thinking he's a girl, got him socially transitioned, and then, you know, absconded with him to California to start the actual medical transition. Whereas when the boy was with his dad, he you know, was a boy, right? And then there's the institutional context, what's happening in the schools. So one thing that I have noticed for years now, and I'm not the only one to point this out, is if you compare teenagers visually now with teenagers from the 1990s, the 1980s, anytime back to, you know, the 1950s, I think the most notable thing is the absence of visual subcultures that you can identify by the fashions that they wear. They all look pretty much they just dress normally, right? With the sole exception of the gender people, who immediately stick out because of, you know, the hair and frequently the obesity, like, frankly, and just like the kind of the sort of slightly punkish look. I mean, we all know the look, right? And they're the only group of teenagers that are identifiable as their own kind of subculture. And, you know, previously the subcultures that would adopt the most outrageous fashions were your kind of your rebels, you know, the stoners, the punks, the goths, and so on. Goths, I miss goths. Goths were great. And now, though, I mean, like, the gender warriors are not rebelling against the institutions. The institutions have their full backs, right? So these kids they're growing up in an institutional context where the progressive stack has become sort of embedded in everything about how they're taught. You know, all the critical race theory, all the feminism, like all of these things that establish this hierarchy of oppression that the kids are growing up in. So if you are a white kid, particularly, you are automatically at the bottom of that stack. You have as the Maoists would put it, a black identity, a bad identity. But you can get a red identity, a good identity. You can go right to the top of the progressive stack simply by saying, oh, actually, my pronouns are they, them. And now, you know, you have a more oppressed identity than the black girl or, you know, the Indian boy or what have you. And because you have the more oppressed identity, no one can touch you. The teachers can't touch you. The other students can't touch you. You can destroy the other students just by claiming that they are transphobic or something like that. You get a lot of power out of this. You basically become the ultimate hall monitor. And the outrageous fashion that they have adopted is the visible symbol of the fact that you should not mess with them, that if you do, they will bring the house down on your head and destroy your life. And then you know, all of the other students, the ones who don't go down that path, who sort of just dress normally, it's almost like they're trying to avoid being noticed, to blend into the background, to avoid drawing the eye of Sauron, basically. So I think that's sort of an important context to look at. Just one more quick thing I want to say, because I want to go back to what Luke mentioned about talking about, like, this kind of idea of, you know, man as a bridge between sort of the higher and the lower, right? And I think that's very true, but I think that frequently gets misunderstood as this idea that we evolve by transcending matter and sort of becoming pure mind. You see this all through science fiction, for example, like the ultimate evolved beings are these energy beings, or they've uploaded their consciousness into computers, or you know, what, that kind of thing. But you know, I think that fundamentally misunderstands what it means to evolve, because, you know, if you think about it, you know, at a most basic level, materially, tautologically, we're material, right? Like, we're made of matter. And that's true for a rock, and it's true for a human being. And as something which is made of matter, we are subject to the rules of matter. If you jump off a building, you will fall and die. Just like if you throw a rock off a building, it will fall down and crack. Similarly, at a level above that, we are biological. We have instincts, we have needs, like any other animal. If we do not eat, if we do not breathe, if we do not go to the bathroom, we will die. And that does not change just because we happen to have large brains. The large brains, the fact mean that we can access the higher realms to a certain degree. That's the kind of bridging function that we have. But it does not mean that we can neglect what the lower aspects of our nature, right? It's a foundation, and the foundation has to be strong. So when they try to cut themselves off from that foundation by sort of becoming pure mind, you end up going really off the rails and hurting yourself very badly. So that's all I wanted to say about that.
Yeah. Just before
Mark's hand has been up for a bit.
Yeah. We go to Mark. Just a very quick response. I think that's a good point about the mind matter relationship, and it seems to me that there's this dialectic going on, which seems to happen quite often, right? So you have one camp basically going to an extreme, then you have the other camp going to the other extreme, and when you actually you would need to find like a wiser approach, a more balanced approach, and not even the middle, but something like smarter, and in this case, it's like, you have the Dawkins crowd, or like the diehard materialists, who deny free will and reduce, like humans to just a bunch of like little thingies inside that control everything. And then on the other hand, you have the counter reaction where people go like, oh, we're just totally free in our minds. We never need to go to the bathroom, if we don't want to, that sort of thing. So yeah, but Mark, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. All right, so everybody said so many things that I want to respond to, but the first thing is that, okay, so, all right, so allow me to steelman, I'm going to steelman trans even more before I take a blowtorch to it. And the way I'm going to steelman it is this. So every society I've ever read about that has ever existed has had some line in the sand of age, some demarcation line, past which human beings are allowed to make big decisions. And for us in the modern West, this basically translates to contract law. When can you sign contracts? And that varies, but basically it's sometime in the late teens, early 20s. And so the way I'd steelman the legality of transgender surgeries and the like is the same argument I give for steelmanning free speech. Because certain bad things might be said or done, and some bad decisions will lead to ruin, and maybe even civilizational ruin. But the risks from making them illegal outstrip the risks for allowing us to choose. But we choose at a certain time. Every society says, well, there's a time when you're capable of making a big choice or taking a big step. And so that said, have you noticed how quickly the cheerleading shifted from consenting adults to children in the trans conversation? It's that kind of sharp and sudden change that should make everyone suspicious, right? So I think like the sudden fanatical drive to make this not just a tolerated social norm amongst consenting adults, but to champion it as the arrival of some great new truth, like the Leninist model of truth, of great leaping, terrifying things, right? And that has to do, for me, with the recent passage of the millennium. And I spoke about this during climate change, and I hate to sound like a broken record, but I think this part of the phenomenon overlaps a whole lot with the doomsday cult that fixates on climate change, or maybe we should call it climate transition or climate transformation, right? And I think that's because large numbers of people are on the hunt for some kind of rapture that transcends the material. They are craving big, sudden, total transformations, whether it's of weather, whether it's of sexual mores, whether it's of political systems. And I think that's because, deep down, like they want these things to have a spiritual component because they sense that that's where real meaning exists, but it's been stolen from them. The problem is there's this big ass God-shaped hole where that kind of transformation usually happens. And like I said, nature abhors the vacuum. And I think it's possible that other kinds of agents, other kinds of animated forces, or animating forces, I should say, might take up residence in that hole, in that void. But either way, they wind up saying a bunch of weird sciencey sounding bullshit. At the end of the day, it translates to, oh, he was born with a female soul, or she was born with a male one. But without having to grapple with what kind of spiritual realities such illogical definitions and combinations of flesh and spirit would reflect, and what kind of goals they might serve. Again, controversial, but in my own language model, those would be the devil's goals, which are essentially, make everyone lonely, scared, angry, and destructive, including self-destructive. But I think even an atheist should consider that there might be religious motives and organizations in play here, regardless. Say there is no higher world or lower world, right? I think they would be especially receptive to the idea that devil worship can be both delusional and real, like in the sense of actually happening, in the sense that there are people out there, deluded as they may be, that believe that the devil is real and can give them powers. I mentioned that a few months back when I spanked the bad cat for it, right? I'm guessing, the majority of trans cheerleaders might look at the rainbow flag and think nothing of it. If I mention it was the banner of the cult of Ishtar in ancient Babylon, whose rites included the ritual feminization of men and masculinization of women, the most they probably say is, it's just a coincidence. Even if you point out the way that trans has essentially swallowed all the other non-dimorphic sexual kinks and categories, that the flag has now come to symbolize transgenderism more than any other kind of fetish or sexual identity, they'll probably just give you a blank stare. And I think that's because they misunderstand a fundamental quality of devil worship, and of Satanism in particular, which is that it defaults to the occult, by which I mean like maintaining secrecy until victory is at hand. That's a key part of the liturgy. I know a bit about this. And so when Sam Smith performs a ritual at the Grammys, or Rihanna does one at the Super Bowl, or Travis Scott at Astroworld, this doesn't necessarily mean that they're all, some sort of witting acolytes, using dupes as part of the whole racket. It's a real religion, and this is part of what they say, And so the same goes for like the perverted adults that see like trans as a new avenue where they can sexually abuse kids. They don't need to believe in anything at all beyond their own sick desires. They don't need to believe in anything but meat. But if we speculate that there are powerful men and women who believe they spiritually profit from building this framework for mass abuse, then something like modern Disney's trans obsession starts to make a whole lot more sense. And so they march together under the cloak of these old banners and symbols. They design Balenciaga ad campaigns featuring little kids with satanic symbols. They choreograph Super Bowl halftime shows. And all of it is disguised in the sunny language of what? Of kindness and tolerance and respect. It's even disguised in science-like terms, developmental poison, like puberty blockers, is called medicine. Permanent sterilization and sexual mutilation is called gender-affirming surgery. I think the enemy, the real enemy, hides in this total wasteland of postmodern language, whether it's spiritual, whether it's material. Everything is the opposite of what it is, but with more syllables. You're not being castrated, you're being liberated from the horrors of the penis. You're not getting your tits chopped off, you're becoming a man, And this is where it becomes, for me at least, I look at it and I try to say, yes, there are people that profit at all levels from any kind of evil. And this is no different.
Mark, you spitting fire there. Mark the prophet.
Thank you. Drive through.
John? Oh, John took his hand
Yeah,
down.
just to build on what Mark
there
was
we go.
saying there. There's a long history of religious movements involving some form of excruciation of the flesh or denial of life or sacrifice of children, the Carthaginians and Moloch, for instance. And you have all of the various Christian groups that would whip themselves or starve themselves, or all these kinds of things. The Aztecs, of course, come to mind. There's so many examples of this that go beyond just the gender inversion, although you do see that as well. But then the contemporary trans thing is also an excruciation of the flesh, because it involves surgery, and particularly surgery involving the reproductive organs, the source of life for the next generation. And then doing it to children, so you've got the child sacrifice aspect to it as well. And it strikes me that in most of these cases, I think if you look into like, okay, how did people come to think that this was a good idea to do? You generally find that they, had some kind of strong religious belief that was maybe misunderstood, that was based on some kind of contradiction. So like for instance, like the idea that we must transcend the material becomes an attack on the material in the Christian tradition, as an example of that. Or, and in the contemporary context, okay, so like Mark said, they're basically saying that, God made a mistake and put the wrong soul into the wrong body. It's a boy's soul in a girl's body, or vice versa. But these people are also atheists. They don't believe in God. They don't believe in souls. So, they're pure materialists. But then if it's pure matter, you're nothing but your body, then how can it doesn't make sense? It's completely incoherent, right?
And John, logic is a white supremacist construct.
Yeah, well, exactly, right. But then, and you look at the Satanists as well. So, when I, like a long time ago, when I was an edgy teenager, I kind of got interested in that, as edgy teenagers do. And I read like, LaVey and, which was sort of misunderstood Nietzscheanism, I understood later. And, I sort of thought to myself after a while, well, hold on, if Satan is real, if demons are real, if you can call upon them for favor and power, well, then that certainly implies that God is real. And if God is far more powerful than Satan, then why wouldn't you align yourself with God instead? It seems like it's the whole idea of Satanism also seems to be based on this like complete, this incoherent view of reality, this kind of incompleteness.
God doesn't let you hurt kids, John.
Yeah.
That's why.
Yeah, well, right. Yeah, exactly. Right. And then like, it all comes down to motivated reasoning, like they want to do these horrible things, and then they construct a justification for that ex post facto, which, if you look at it from a distance without close investigation, you're like, I guess that makes sense. There's a lot of big words in there, but the moment you start poking on it, you find all of these inconsistencies, and it just all falls apart. So that's all I wanted to say.
Brand?
So I'm just concerned about the issue with the children, right? I think that's the most important thing. And one of you said it earlier in this discussion, how it went from consenting adults to all of a sudden now trying to ensure that children have access to these decisions that have permanent consequences. And so I really only see two acceptable ways to approach it in a free society. And the first is to have an age of consent that's non-negotiable, where legally, you don't allow children to make permanent decisions for themselves when, at whatever age society agrees that they're not prepared to make those decisions for themselves. And that probably has to do with contracts. Alternatively, if you're really wanting children to have access to that kind of thing, the only way that you could conceivably advocate for that, from my perspective, is by allowing the parents to make that determination. And I think that would allow, facilitate some degree of horrors, because I don't think it's ever appropriate for that decision to be like a permanent decision like that to be made for a child. But I'm willing to defer to parents. But at this time, there's laws in California where they're trying to make it so that children have access to these things in spite of the parents knowing. And this has also happened with healthcare in the Navy, where there's, for contraception and things like that, children, like a 15-year-old's able to go and talk to a provider, and that information isn't made available to parents unless they specifically request the medical records. And so this trend in that direction, I think normal people, the vast majority of people, view that as unacceptable. Trying to allow children to have access to these controversial treatments without the parents knowing is just, I think it's just crazy, especially because we just don't have data. And they throw out these figures and arguments like you can have a live girl or a dead son, like you have a live daughter or a dead son, that kind of thing, as if it's a foregone conclusion that suicide is the only alternative to gender affirming care. And I don't think the data bears that out. It's just not there. And so they're being disingenuous on top of it all. And then the only other thing that I wanted to say is about identity and building connection. And John mentioned in the comments, Dugan talking about the liberation from all unchosen identities, and that being a part of the trans phenomenon. And I think that there's something to that. I think that, like me as a man, right? That's a part of my identity that I have that I can use to relate to other men that nobody can ever take from me. And if I decide to transition, all of a sudden, now the number of people I can relate to based on that identity has just been cut by a factor of 1,000. And then to take it further, going into transhumanism, where it's like I feel like the very idea of our humanity and our ability to connect with one another on the basis of being human is ultimately under attack by this ideology. But at the end of the day, I'm fine with people pursuing things that are controversial that I don't think are going to be effective, but I'd like them to use their own money to do it. And that's the other big problem, is that taxpayer dollars are getting spent towards these things. Third-party payer systems, large corporations, like with insurance, and that just creates all sorts of moral hazards where, I really think, and if we're talking healthcare, the way ahead is having that medical provider and that patient working together to come up with a plan, and that patient bearing the response, like both of them bearing some responsibility for the decision that gets made in the long term. And then also just in terms of how it gets funded. But that's kind of the sum of my thoughts after listening to you guys.
Something just occurred to me as you were talking, Grant, and you're drawing the connection with transhumanism there, and the connection with this idea that's being implanted into the culture that children should be able to consent. And the usual critique you hear of this idea of minors consenting is that it's related to pedophilia, which I believe there's something to, but there could be also something, take something like Neuralink, right? Could it be that it will turn out that such technologies are best implanted in young children while their brains are still highly plastic, and that in order to make a human into a transhuman of some sort, you have to start as early as possible. And thus, if you accustom the population both to the idea of the plasticity of the human body in order to conform to an arbitrary chosen identity. But on top of that, you accustom them to the idea that children can, in scare quotes, choose to do this themselves at a very young age. This could be quite essential to the transhuman project. So that's just kind of a scary thought that occurred to me. Daniel, go ahead.
Oh yeah. So Grant, what you were bringing up about people with their kids and the California law in particular. I know Chris Bray on his Substack has gone into depths in that. It's I guess the bills are sponsored by this California State Senator Scott Wiener. But if you know anything about him, it's like the last person that should be involved with making decisions about people's kids. But it's interesting because of course the same people that would say this is great, we need to give government the power to just take kids away from their parents because the parents don't want them to get these irreversible experimental surgeries and treatments to change genders. They're the same folks that would decry for religious reasons parents like what Christian Science that's don't believe in healthcare at all for kids. So remember there was some kids that I think had like a strep infection and then wound up dying because a parent refused medical treatment that would have easily saved the child's life. And so it's just like, oh, this is child abuse. The government needs to step in and protect kids from parents making these bad decisions about their kids' health. And in this case, it's like, the case of the guy from Texas whose wife, I guess, went to California with the kid. It's like, and I'm probably articulating this badly, but it seems like there's a conflict there where it's just, again, underscores that the ideology is just a smokescreen for power grabs. And, when we want power over your kids, we're going to claim that it's, in the interest of the kids to do it. But whereas before it was legitimate, maybe, I mean, if you say that the kid's in danger of their health being harmed by refusing proven treatments, and now it's we're going to run this risk with your kids' health based on something they told a guidance counselor at school, and you don't have the ability to step in and protect your kid from this. I don't know, but I think I butchered all that, but just going on real quick, what Mark said, talking about the spiritual angle of it. I mean, it's interesting. You had this whole overlapping network of incentives where they take away your identity in a way by teaching you your old identity is bad, or you can transcend it somehow. And so it's an identity that comes with this lifetime subscription model, similar to like a Netflix, or music or whatever. It's like you're now, you can have the surgery, but you got this lifetime of medical treatments you're going to need. So it's like this identity, we're selling you a new identity. So it's not even like the existentialist model of existence preceding essence, and you can become or make a decision to become something. It's like you can do that, but it's going to require all this medical intervention and high tech surgery and hormone therapy the rest of your life and all that. It's like, and it just so happens that it makes a shit ton of money for the usual suspects who seem to be behind all these changes, whether it's the COVID, and the response to that or whatever it is. But then with all right, one more thing, spiritual angle of it. Like, I remember the part in Screw Tape Letters, or C.S. Lewis has the junior demon that's tempting the guy in the human, the junior demon is tempting the human, and he's warned by the elder demon, not to push too hard. If you push too hard, you'll give up the game. It's like if you push too hard, then he'll recognize what's going on, and that'll push him towards God. And it's interesting because it seems like that's a way of arriving at theism is looking at how, it, as a description of how this all works, you could look at hundreds of years or millennia even of these patterns and say, like, there's no way a human on their own, just with their own, if they're psychopathic, they're not going to be devoting themselves to a cause that's going to be coming to fruition generations after they're dead and buried. It's like this type of coordination on such a large scale, where it seems to conveniently always arrive at these places where these same outcomes happen. And then where it's based on these lies that are so clever and so infectious, they're like a mind virus, literally. It's like the way a computer virus works. Hijacks the mental operating system and turns it against itself and into just a machine to propagate more of the mind virus. It's like when you have that, and the lies are so perfect, and then you have an explanation. Well, there is this supernatural being that, or whatever it is, entity, egregore, whatever you want to call it, that its weapon is lies, perverting the truth, taking a grain of truth and giving it a twist to, instead of misdirect you from something that would benefit you to something that would harm you and cause you to harm others. It's like, it seems to have a lot of explanatory power, whether it's literally true or not. This idea that there's this demonic angle seems to have a lot of explanatory power. And then paradoxically, if there's demons, as John was pointing out, there must be a counterpart, the whole symmetry thing. There must be a God. And I don't know. Sorry about all the word salad there with all my jangled, mixed up metaphors.
Nah,
That made a lot
was
of
great,
sense,
man.
Daniel.
That was great. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I want to reply to something Grant said and then something Daniel just said. So first, on the kind of libertarian angle, I think that we're in a strange position, because I think if you'd look at the world even 10 years ago or 15 years ago, we just didn't do certain things, right? And partly because we didn't need to. So we didn't need to have laws to, like the battle between the California states and the Texas states with essentially trafficking children to, well, you've got like Vermont and California and several others. So they're all trying to become these sanctuary states for trans surgeries and treatments, where they're basically saying, well, it might be illegal in all those countries, or all those states, but we won't recognize that. Everyone can come here and avoid any kind of legal consequences that might have come about from their home states. So they're trying to create these kind of law-free zones through their own legislation. But all of this stuff on children, it just, it wouldn't have really entered into the culture, into the practices that we actually engage in as people in whatever society, in this case in the United States. And so I think that there's something more to it. I think there's got to be more to it than just, okay, well, we have to, I think it's important that we do the things that you said, Grant, like have this kind of absolute age of consent and give the parents more legal power. But the fact that we even have to make those decisions or consider those as options means that something else is really going wrong. That the fact that we're not already doing that without the necessity of having those laws in place, like there's something about the wider culture that has gone so far overboard that those are just kind of like a corrective measure that needs to be implemented, but at the same time that it doesn't address the fact of why it's happening, or getting at whatever the root causes might be. And of course that's hard to do, right? It's not like it's easy to figure out what all the root causes are and to deal with them. So I think that's kind of a necessary step. I just wanted to make the point that there is something else there is something else going on, and that might, those steps taken might ameliorate the problem slightly, but but you'd still have all the parents who buy into it, right? And you mentioned this, that you still have the parents that would offer that parental consent. And you see that in like the videos that of like the nurses in the clinics who are all like happy and sweet about how much care they're providing, and how trans kids can get the treatment they need. And it's like this just total brainwashing, where it to a significant percentage of the population, it does seem like the good and the kind and the caring thing to do. And I think that just as a society, we'd need to kind of brainstorm some more ideas for how to tackle that angle of it, aside from just the strictures that we might place, and the hard rules that we might place. And just one more comment on what Daniel said and what Mark had said at the beginning of the show, is on the kind of demonic angle here. This ties into something Luke had said too, about the whole mind matter distinction, and this idea of transcending matter and entering this even kind of like purely mental state. Ties in with what John was saying about the sci-fi thing too, how we have this image of the transcendent being who totally transcends the material body. But the way that it seems to be manifesting is in this kind of total rejection of the way the world is. And from that perspective, it's anti-nature. And if you look at nature as from a theistic, like religious or spiritual perspective, if you look at nature as the expression of the nature of God, or the nature of being itself, then there's something very anti anti-reality, anti-existence, anti-God, anti-nature about this idea of about this conception of transcending. And it's almost it is almost this kind of elevation of anti-existence, of non-existence. It seems to me like there's this tie between your essence, who you are, and how we're expressed in the forms that we live and that we breathe in these bodies. And when you with your mind and with your emotions, try your best to sever that, to say, no, there's this fundamental disagreement between who I am and the material world. You're basically saying there's a fundamental disagreement between you and wider reality, and including an essential part of your own reality, which is your physical form, which is the body that you inhabit. And I think that if you go into this kind of like metaphysical dimension, the end result of that is this kind of like obliteration of the self, because when you totally disconnect yourself from the very basic reality of which you're a part, and this very basic reality that expresses the form and the laws and the mind of God, or the universe, or just the way things are, the way things can and should be. When you break that, you cut yourself off from reality. And what might be the result of that is just a kind of like extinction of an extinction of the self, a total like break with reality. And what do we call breaks with reality? Like in just the common parlance and the mainstream, it's psychosis. It's a break with reality. It's not a healthy state. It means something is fundamentally broken. And so I think that's kind of what we're seeing. We're seeing a mass break with reality, and a willful and gleeful break with reality. And I think that ties in with just all the nasty stuff that we've talked about. But Mark, you want to respond?
You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to build off of some of the things that Harrison was saying there, which were excellent. And also what Grant was building off, what Grant was talking about, because there's a tension there, right? So the tension on the political legal side is pretty obvious. It's like, well, who is in charge of children? Who's in charge of the decisions that are made about them? And so the argument could be made, if in anything but an anarcho-capitalist system, you could say like, well, yeah, the parents are generally in charge, but at a certain point, the government, or quote unquote, the society could step in and they could say like, hey, you can't do that to those kids, even though they're yours, right? That's on the one hand. And then what Harrison was talking about was, I think that like, this is when he says, in other words, like that, okay, well, these people are essentially rejecting reality. And I think that's instructive because like, I don't think that that's possible. I don't think it's possible to reject reality. It's possible to reject one side of reality. Like if we were to think of it, reality again, as a kind of supersymmetry. So what you can do in small ways, and then in, and also in larger ways, in simple ways, in complex and dynamic ways, what you can do is assert one side of that equation. You can feel and give voice to one portion, one half of, to one side of the mirror or the other. And maybe that's not even the best way to put it. And so like to fuse those two, to fuse the legal and political problems with the problem of saying like, well, they can't deny reality. What they can do is they can reject life and striving and growth and the continuance of the experiment of life, like the continuance of this project, this quest that we're on. Maybe some people don't see any quest. Maybe they just say you're crazy. It's going to live and you're going to die. And like the span of years between those two concepts are essentially meaningless. And like that's the atmosphere that I was raised in. I was raised to be a nihilist. I sometimes I tell people I was raised half Catholic and half atheist, but in reality, I was raised and trained as a nihilist. And so and so when we say that like people are running to concepts that are illogical, yes, irrational, self-destructive, there are all of these things. But I don't think that they're necessarily unreal in the sense that they're making a choice. And it's a choice that, is going to lead them down a bad path. Now, if parents make that choice for their children, if they say, okay, little Johnny, he's fighting these imaginary dragons in the sandbox, and we're just going to say like, yeah, you're right, Johnny, those dragons exist, and say like, okay, we're going to get you surgery so you can help fight them better. It's sort of like it's not that they're rejecting reality. They're accepting, well, first of all, they're allowing little Johnny to run them. Like it's not even really parental authority at that point. Johnny in his imagination runs the show. They're really rejecting the whole idea that parents are in charge. The parents are nominally like going to be signing the contracts and dealing with the sort of the minutia of like getting little Johnny on the puberty blocking poisons and getting little Johnny eventually, hopefully this isn't the case very often now, but I have a feeling that it's coming, getting little Johnny on the in the hospital bed to get little Johnny snipped off. And there are people that are pushing for that. And I think we have to say these people are evil, whether it's not the children necessarily, they're fighting those dragons, but like the parents who make that decision, it would be akin to saying, to me at least, well, parents should have the ability to decide, to just sort of suffocate little Johnny in his sleep, let's say. After all, it's their flesh and blood. Little Johnny's, they can do whatever they want with them. They can make that choice. Or if little Johnny asks them to do it, little Johnny says, you know what, I'm kind of tired of life. Too many dragons. Can you help me out of it? Can you smother me in my sleep? It's like yeah, we could say, if we were just looking at it strictly from a political, legal, libertarian standpoint, we could say, like, we could say, oh yeah, the parents make those decisions, and like all of those decisions are, we have to accept. But if those are your neighbors, how much do you want those people to be your neighbors? And that's what I have to say.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think going along the same theme of making a choice, I think it's the same choice that Luke gets after with a lot of his writings on being on the path. And what Harrison was saying about being disconnected, I think ultimately you're disconnecting yourself from the source of yourself by putting perception above reality. I mean, I don't view nature as moral. I think nature is amoral. I think where morality comes into play is what we do with nature. And I think our best chance of doing good and being on the path is knowing and understanding our nature and working with it. And in that context of trans, it just seems so straightforward to me that the easier thing to do, the more optimal strategy, if there's a disconnect between your thoughts, feelings, and emotions and your physical body, is to work on changing your thoughts, feelings, and emotions. I mean, those, like, there are ways to do that with cognitive behavioral therapy and other strategies. That's totally possible. But as soon as you, for example, throw hormones into the mix, it makes all that so much more difficult. You know, if you're a male and you're throwing a bunch of estrogen on top, or if you're female and you're taking exogenous testosterone, the emotions that comes with are alien and different and new, and you have to process them. And so if you had a chance of pursuing that strategy of trying to engage with therapy and really focusing on trying to gain control of your thoughts, your chances of being successful go down as soon as you start with hormones. And you know, then you can get more confused, and then surgery is you know the next step after that. So I just think in general, people don't understand what health is. They don't understand how valuable it is until they don't have it. And to take a perfectly healthy, functioning body and mind and tinker with them in ways that make it more difficult for it to function the way that it was evolved to function. You know, we talk about paleo for nutrition. It's like, what's like, this is not paleo, right? So that's kind of the stuff that comes into my head when I see people taking drastic action. And it's not just with this issue, it's really with anything. People assuming a lot of risk when it comes to their health, because I think they take it for granted until you don't have it, and then there's very little you can do to get it back. So I'm not gonna say anything else. That was my closing thoughts, because we've been going, you know, nearly an hour and a half. John's got his hand up, so I'll kick it over to him. But then I recommend we just go through the line and everybody share closing thoughts, and we wrap it up.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. So I'll offer mine, but actually I just wanted to like pull out one of the things you said about it always being, you know, easier to change your emotions and thoughts than your body. And, you know, there's a counterexample there. Of course, you know, say you are in terrible physical condition, you're fat and so on, and this is making you depressed. Well, actually, the way to make yourself not depressed isn't to change your feeling about, you know, being fat and in terrible condition. It's to start exercising and eating right, to literally change your body, right? So it's not as simple as an either or. You can always sort of find a counterexample there. And
It's a bi-directional relationship.
yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
It's all the same. I'm just
And
trying to
and
give an example, but I'm 100% on board.
yeah, no, I knew you would agree with that 100%. Yeah. I think sometimes there's something of a tendency to try and over intellectualize this kind of thing. Spawned an entire theological discipline of theodicy, the problem of evil, right? But at the end of the day, it's an instinctive thing. You look at children being led down this path, and it's evil. That there's no other way to put it. And you either see it or you don't. And if you don't, well, maybe you're evil, frankly. And this, you can try to intellectualize it, but it's a very instinctive thing. And then it's, Harrison asked, I think, the most pertinent question, which is, what is to be done? How does society deal with this? We can imagine various regulatory things, no teaching gender theory to toddlers, like in Florida, for instance. But a lot of this does seem like a Band-Aid on a sucking chest wound. So I think, that the devil is ultimately a very ridiculous figure. Like, yes, he is evil, but he is absurd because his worldview is so fundamentally contradictory. He is so blind, he sees only what he wants to see and not what is really there. And because he is absurd, the way to exorcise the devil is to laugh at him. And this is something that I think the culture has been doing increasingly over the last several years. You don't show up to drag queen story hour and yell and shout and scream. First of all, the cops will just arrest you, but second, like, that actually just, like, it feeds the conflict, right? It makes the gender warriors think they're really warriors and not what they really are. But when you laugh at the absurd, when you tell jokes about the tyrants, it reduces their social status. And as that spreads through the culture, as the tyrants start to realize that everyone is chuckling at them behind their backs, that they are a figure of fun, they start to lose support. They start to lose their confidence because they know that everyone's kind of snickering at them. And okay, so you have this problem of all of these liberal mothers with the Munchausen's by proxy, right? Well, why are they doing that? Because they think it's high status. You have the problem of the teachers doing this in the schools. Why are they doing it? Because they think it's high status. You have the problem of the teenage girls with the rapid onset gender dysphoria. Why are they doing it? Because they think it's high status. So you make it so it's not high status anymore. And the way to do that, going right back to Paleolithic times, when the hunters would, bring the chieftain down to size by making jokes about how big his nose was or whatever, is to make jokes. So that's my closing statement. Laugh at evil.
Yeah. So quick closing statement from my side. I think ultimately, how do you fight the devil? I think you can only fight it or him or they, whatever, by, like,
whatever pronouns he prefers to use.
Yeah. I'm sure he has some preferred
I think it's
pronouns.
Caesar, actually. Yeah.
So I think it's got to be via information, jokes, that sort of thing, right? I mean, there's no other way, I think, than you can do some damage control, maybe via laws and stuff, but ultimately it's got to be like on the spiritual, if you will, sphere, aka like the information war. And also, what does the devil have to offer? What's their proposition? It's basically gaining power, knowledge, without effort, right? I mean, that's the Faustian pact, right? And that's what John and talked about as well, like the status thing. You get status for nothing, right? For free. It's always the same thing with the devil, right? And how do you battle that? I mean, yeah, it's grand, as you said. It's like it's personal growth, and that is like working on the mind, emotions, and body. Basically, it's really that simple. Although it takes a lot of effort, and some people might be like more naturals on the intellectual realm. So they might have deficits with their emotions and body or whatever. For other people, it's different, but that's basically it. That's what we can do. That what those who struggling with the trans issue, can do. Change your thought. You are not your thoughts. It's you are not your emotions are not your identity, right? Your body is not even like your full identity. You can work on those things. I mean, not just by fiat. That's the devil's delusion again, right? The devil's proposition is to the illusion that you can change all that, just like that, right? Without effort. No, it takes a lot of effort, and it always works within the constraints of nature, and including the body, including the material world, and all of that. But yeah, that's my long-term solution.
Yeah,
Oh,
I don't know if
so-
I have any closing thoughts, or I'll be really quick, Daniel, because I don't really have much to say. I think that the one thing to be done is probably for parents. One thing parents can do is severely restrict their kids' access to social media. And I just think that's one small thing that can probably make something of a difference. I've heard anecdotally from some parents that's worked. Other than that, yeah, I don't know. I will cede my time to Daniel.
I just want to say I identify as they, them on my tax return this year, and claimed multiple personal exemptions. I encourage you guys to do the same. Now, the thing with this whole trans thing, my closing thing is just like, it's a war against reality. I mean, it's like on the Truman Show, there's this dome that it contained his little artificial reality. And, it's like you can do that on a very small scale, try to block out reality, because you're not going to change it, by wishing it were otherwise. It's like you can just create your own little space where you pretend that this is reality. But the bigger they try to make it, the more expensive it gets to maintain. As Grant, you put it in your great essay about us being a late stage bureaucracy. It was just increasingly inefficient, and the run by basically the grift that is the Federal Reserve and the US dollar. It gets more expensive to maintain this fiction, and as it gets bigger and more outrageous, you're not leaving aside steel manning the transgender stuff. There's legitimate intersex people. Like there's a South African distance runner that was like chromosomally male but anatomically female, birth defect or whatever it was. And it's like, yeah, that's a different scenario than what we see today, where it's basically a Maoist way to give yourself a good identity in today's culture war. It's like, hey, I'm a they them. I just shot straight to the top of the victimology hierarchy. But it's like that just becomes more and more expensive to maintain this illusion as it gets bigger and more preposterous. And so the whole thing's going to come crashing down. I think like what John said about laughing at it, laughing at the devil, laughing at the devil's minions, waging their war on reality and human nature and all that, is just laugh at this shit, have fun with it. And in a few years, we'll be looking back and people will be, how the fuck did they believe that crazy shit about, you could just put on a dress and some lipstick and, hey, I'm a girl now and woohoo. Or even in Dylan Mulvaney, I guess, identifying not just as a girl, but as a 6-year-old to boot. So anyway, life's rich pageant.
Worse. Dylan Mulvaney identifies as a successful advertising campaign.
That's too good.
Mark, why don't you close this out, man?
All right, I'll give it a shot. Well, first of all, I agree with everybody, in particular the comedy part. And it made me think of something. I thought, it's sort of like when I was a kid, I don't know, I'm a sort of a early extra, let's say. And so when I was a teenager in the 90s, I recall that there was another sort of maybe sociogenic virus that was going around. And this was that girls, teenage girls, were constantly kissing and hooking up and stroking each other. They all claimed to be bisexual. Probably 1 in 1,000 of them actually was. I'm not even sure if that's a real category. What they were doing was titillating. They were attracting attention to themselves. They were drawing the male gaze. In other words, gaze meaning Gaze, by the way, not the male gaze. That's a different group. But in any case, so like I was thinking back on that, and I was saying like, well, Mark, transport yourself into this new reality, into this world, into the current generation. And I thought about what I might be doing if I was a teenager in 2023. And do you know what I thought I might be doing? I thought I might be organizing like a big trans soccer team or basketball team or baseball team, softball team or something. Like, in other words, I'd be getting a bunch of guys together and I'd say like, here's what we'll do. We'll all wear dresses. We'll all say we're she's and hers and all this other stuff just for this 1 year. So we could go and win the championship. And I think that would be hilarious. And I have a feeling there are some merry pranksters out there that are up to it. And I hope they do it, because these are the kind of things, to echo everybody else, it's the jokes, people. It's what's going to win the day. It's why they try to crush you. They know how powerful it is. They know that to laugh at the devil is to defeat him instantly. Guy goes up in a wisp of smoke, whether you believe him or not, or if you just think of the devil as some combination of human energies and egregoric gestalt beings, or whatever you want to call them. Like, essentially, yeah, like that is their, it kills them like raid kills roaches. They scurry away. They may try to put up a fight at first, but they're gonna lose that energy very quick. And we would win overnight if young men just said like, hey, let's not get angry about this. And young women, by the way. If young people in general and old codgers like me, if we all just decided like, hey, let's laugh this off, then I think that victory will come sooner rather than later. And that's it.
Thank you, gentlemen, for the wonderful discussion. And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Tonic Discussions Episode 2, Trans. If you enjoyed what you heard, like, subscribe, leave a comment. And we will see you all next time.
See you guys.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everyone.
Adios, everyone.